So let's try to prove this wrong implication here. And like I said, it's equally important, if not more important, to know how to fail to prove things that are incorrect, right? You don't want to just be able to prove everything. If you can prove everything, then that means you're terrible at proofs, right? So you want to be able to see how it's impossible to prove wrong things. So here, this wrong implication, so this entire thing here is wrong, just to be clear. I don't want this to be screenshotted out of context or something. This entire thing here is wrong, and it should sound wrong. Everything has something that it loves. That should not sound like it implies that there is something which is loved by everything. So let's start with our wrong proof. So it's an implication, so I'll assume the left-hand side. Assume that everything has something that it loves. So assume that for all y, there's something that y loves. Now my goal is to prove the right-hand side that there is something which is loved by everything. So how do I prove that there is something which is blah, 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 blah? How do I prove that there exists something that has a certain property? Well, I have to find an example. So my goal is to find an example of an x, to find an example of something which is loved by everything. So I want to prove this for an example thing here. Nothing wrong yet. That makes perfect sense. If you want to prove that there's something which has a certain property, find an example. That's existential generalization. So my goal now is to prove this for a certain x, for a certain specific x. Okay, well, if I want to prove a universally quantified statement, then I should do universal generalization. So consider any y. And then I will try to prove that y loves x. So suppose after a bunch of talking, I manage to prove, therefore y loves x. And then I say, okay, then by universal generalization, since that was an arbitrary y, all y's love x. And then now I've found something, x, which everything loves. So I can say, okay, so then there exists something which everything loves. So that's the plan, and that's a perfectly reasonable plan. And I think it is correct that if I manage to say a bunch of stuff and prove this, and reach, y loves x here, then this would be valid. So let's see if that pans out. Okay, so my goal now is to prove that y loves x. Well, I know this. I know that y loves something, right? I know that y loves something. So since everything has something that it loves, y in particular has something that it loves. So we have in particular, this is universal instantiation. We have in particular that our y that we considered here has something that it loves. Okay, well, if y has something that it loves, then we can give a name to that something, right? So we have an existential here. Let's do some existential instantiation to make use of this. So y has something that it loves. Let's call that something x. So we can get an x such that y loves x. Okay, well that looks like we reached what we needed to reach, right? We can get an x such that y loves x. And so it sounds like we have proven that everything loves x, right? So therefore, I mean, the universal generalization started here, and after consider any y, it looks like I reached y loves x. So have I not proven that for all y loves x? So have I not proven that everything loves x? And if I've proven everything loves x, then haven't I found an x which is loved by everything? Haven't I proven that there's something which is loved by everything? So it looks like the proof succeeded. It looks like I'm finished. So this in blue, that was our universal generalization. And let me highlight other things that happened. We did a universal instantiation also. Here. Sorry. Yeah, here. This was a universal instantiation. And we had an existential instantiation here. Actually, I think I used yellow for existential generalization last time. I don't remember what colors I used, but this is an existential instantiation. And then at the end, we did an existential generalization, going from everything loves x to there's something which is loved by everything. Going from x is loved by everything to something is loved by everything. Okay, so all four rules got involved, and everything seems right. So I hope you're a little bit puzzled now about how the rules work. How were we able to prove this very clearly false thing? This is not true. Something is wrong. What's wrong? So of the four basic quantifier rules, some are very straightforward, and some have subtleties. So here are the four rules. The straightforward ones are universal instantiation and existential generalization. And the ones that had subtleties were these two, UG and EI. So the mistake in these kinds of situations is either going to be the UG or the EI, usually. In this case, the EI is perfectly fine. So to say, to go from there exists something that y loves to go from y loves something to y loves x, and naming that thing x for the sake of our proof, that's perfectly fine as long as x wasn't previously used for anything else, and it wasn't, right? There were no previous mentions of x until we reached this point. This was the first mention of x. All of these other mentions of x, it was quantified, right? Those were not actual mentions of x. This is the first mention of x itself. So the EI is perfectly fine. So the problem must be with the UG. Okay, so let me click on universal generalization and review the rule for it. So the universal generalization allows me to prove for all x phi in a context where I've made no assumptions about the variable x. So in other words, x has to be arbitrary. This is the subtle point. There's be no assumptions about the variable x. Okay, in my context, it's actually y that's showing up being universally quantified. So the way UG works is it allows me to prove something like this. For all y, a certain thing is true about y, by proving what's inside here while making no assumptions about y. Y has to remain arbitrary. The problem is, after I say we can get an x such that y loves x, the y ceases to be arbitrary. It becomes a y that loves this particular x. So the existential instantiation serves to kind of bring in an assumption about y. This is not just an arbitrary y. Maybe after this line, after I say consider any y, y was arbitrary. But now it's after this green line here, it's no longer just any y. It's a y that loves this particular x. So it doesn't make sense. I hope intuitively to you, it does not make sense to go from y loves this particular x to every y loves x. So the y stopped being arbitrary as soon as this assumption came in, that y loves x in particular. So part of what I'm doing here is I'm trying to scare you a little bit and show you that if you're not careful, you can just say stuff and end up proving something that's wrong. So the main thing to pay attention to is this idea of a variable having to be arbitrary for the sake of an argument. It's more subtle than it sounds at first, and I think with practice you'll develop hopefully an intuitive sense for when these kinds of universal generalization arguments work. So it's possible to write down very precise formal rules as to what it means exactly for a variable to be arbitrary. But even if you write down the precise formal rules, I hope you're seeing here that it's still very easy to make mistakes. And what will save you mainly in the end is having a strong intuitive sense also for what allows universal generalization to work.